Okay. A quick housekeeping point for those of you at home. We've just been discussing how difficult it is to use the online book, and especially the online listening guides. Partly because they appear and then they disappear right away because you can't see the context as well if it's just you're scrolling through it, and it's hard to see the whole thing in its form. So what I think I'm going to try to do is to upload copies of the listening guides for you at home as well, and so that you can have these physically in front of you when you listen to the music. One of the things, like, as I mentioned, we want to get more deeply into the music. We want to see the parts. We want to be able to hear a little bit more. In order to do that, I think we need something, the typical Baroque problem, right? To find something static in all this motion. And physically, when you're studying, you need something static in front of you in order to find the form. So that, just first of all, let's begin now with Bach's Cantata number 140. Wachet auf, ruft uns die Stimme, it's the German. It's called Wake Up, the Voice is Calling. Now I want to give you a little bit of background into the poetic background of this thing, or the poetic symbolism of this thing, because it's really interesting. It's an Advent piece. And what is Advent, real quickly? Obviously, dumb question. What is the church season of Advent? Remember that Bach had to write one of these every week. And this was one that he wrote during the Advent season. No? Cool. It's the time before Christmas. It's the 4 weeks before Christmas. So the first Sunday of Advent is sometimes the first Sunday of December, sometimes the last Sunday in November. And in the church year, it's the time of preparation for the birth of Jesus. So it's the preparation, the lead up to Christmas. Now, interestingly enough, of course, Christmas is, for when you're 5 years old, Christmas is the most important Christian holiday because Santa Claus comes, which is a different issue. That's not part of the symbolism here. For the Christian calendar, actually, Christmas is not so important as Easter. Easter in the Christian theology is a much more important symbolic moment because it defines our understanding of the theology of Christianity in terms of both life after death, the resurrection, and in terms of forgiveness of sins, which comes through the symbolism of the Last Supper and that sort of thing. We're setting that aside, though. That's Easter. We're talking about Christmas, which is the coming of Jesus into the world. Just a minor point that Christmas is sort of a minor holiday, more of a minor holiday than Easter. But, interestingly enough, Christmas comes. Nobody knew when Jesus was born. I mean, what his real birthday was, nobody knew that, right, in the Christian world. Even in the 2nd, 3rd century when they decided, okay, we're going to put it on December 25th. That was a decision made in about the 3rd century, I think, or the 2nd century. Why December 25th? Does anyone know what is really close to that date every year in terms of not the Christian's calendar, but in terms of the natural cycle of the world? If you think of the cycles of nature, the cycles of the seasons, what is, I forget when it was this year, was it 23rd? And we're still suffering it from now. I just was saying, before we started class, I said it's really annoying to start class when it's so dark outside. But, does that help? The solstice, right? The solstice is the darkest day of the year. What does that mean? It means it's the longest night and the shortest amount of light, right? So up until the solstice, the world is getting darker and darker and darker, right? So to speak, right? And after the solstice, it starts getting lighter and lighter and lighter, right? And the early Christians said, okay, that's when we're going to say, when Jesus came into the world, right at that point, right, when it starts shifting from getting darker and darker to lighter and lighter. It's pretty clever. Okay, so Jesus' birthday was on December 25th. Not because we have his birth certificate, but because that's symbolically kind of cool, right? So light comes back into the world, and the light, of course, has long symbolism. We'll talk about this some other day when we do Greek mythology and Apollo and all that stuff. You can look it up. Okay, so that's the first part of the symbolism. But through Advent, it's still getting darker and darker. So throughout Advent, those 4 weeks before Christmas, We're still, so to speak, in darkness. And you can see that all over. Go just take out a Christian hymnal. Next time you're in church, if you're in church every time, take out the hymnal and go through the Advent hymn. Not the Christmas hymns, but the Advent hymns. And they're all about darkness. Right? They're all about slavery. They're all about, so we are in bondage, we are in darkness, and the light came into, we're waiting for the light, it's not coming yet. And so the Advent symbolism is still a world of darkness. The post-Christmas symbol is the light coming into the world. It makes some sense, right, in terms of symbolism. Okay, now let's take it one step further. The symbolism of this story, wake up, the voice is calling. Whose voice are we talking about? We're talking about the voice of a night watchman. Now, a night watchman was not a religious figure at all. The night watchman was a job that you had. It wasn't a very good job. It didn't pay very well, and it was kind of a bummer. But if you lived in the Middle Ages, and any of these walled cities in Germany or England or in Northern Europe, even in Italy, it meant that somebody had to, through the night, go through the city, make sure there were no fires, first of all, walk along the ramparts along the city wall to make sure that nobody was trying to get in and attacking, right, that the enemy wasn't coming. And that guy had a horn, a post horn, they would call it later on, because it was, if you look at the German post office, the symbol of the post office is still this horn, right? And because the horn had various calls that you could make, military calls, still used sort of symbolically in the Marines today, or so forth and so on, right? The horn had various functions. One of the functions was to watch for fires, and if there was a fire, he blew the horn, and there was a certain alarm, right? Another one was to watch for enemies, as I was saying before. If there was somebody coming that wanted to get into the city, usually had to alert the people at the gates of the city and so forth. It's really an interesting job. He was armed as well.
Just one person?
One person usually. It depends on the size of the city. A city like Nuremberg, which is a pretty big town, even in the Middle Ages, probably had several. But a city like Rothenburg, which is a really small town, like 4,000 or 5,000, size of Hards Grove, something like that, was a walled city. You could still walk around the wall in Rothenburg, by the way. And by the way, there's a guy who's making quite a good living pretending to be the watchman and taking tourists around with his, he wears his thing and carries a horn. I highly recommend it. He does one in English and one in German every night and gets an awful lot of money out of us. But anyway, that's beside the point. But the most interesting for this symbolism, for this piece, is that he also watches the stars and the planets, in particular when Venus, I don't know the astronomy of this very well, but Venus is in a particular place. It's called the morning star. It's not a star at all. It's a planet. But when it's a particular place in the heavens, we know that it's about time for the sun to rise, but it's not there yet. And he blows his horn in order to alert those people who have to get up early, the bakers. I don't know who those people all are in the Middle Ages, but certainly the bakers, because they have to start baking at 3 or 4 in the morning, right? And so he's the guy who can look into the darkness, and looking at the sky, the signs in the sky, you can see where we're heading, right? He knows that the light is coming. Okay, so that, pretty boring job. But out of this boring job comes a really interesting symbolism that the early Christians said, well, that's kind of like, the prophets looking out into the darkness that we were all in, darkness of sin, the darkness of not knowing what happens to us after we die, and knowing that the light is coming, answers to these questions, life after death, and that kind of thing, forgiveness of sins, right? And when with Jesus comes new light, etc. So we're going to play with the symbolism of the night watchman, right? And the first 3 notes of this chorale, this melody that we're going to play with in this song are this. Where are we starting? It's in B flat. And it's wake awake in English. Wake awake, the night is flying. Right? It's Wachet auf, ruft uns die Stimme. In German, wake up, the voice is calling to us. It so happens, when you're playing a horn, Does anyone play a brass instrument or has played a brass instrument? No? Those are the notes you can play without playing with the valves, because valves were something that they didn't have in the Middle Ages. So you could go boom, 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 boom. You can play these triads. You can't go like this. You can't do that because the notes don't come out of the instrument. There are technical reasons for that, but it doesn't matter, right? So these three notes actually come right out of the horn. So it's as if the horn is calling into the night, saying, something's about to happen. It's imitating, in other words, the intervals. Intervals are the spaces between notes of the horn. So the very first thing you hear, at least the chorus singing, when they start singing, is the sound of the horn. Now, Bach himself didn't write that melody. He borrowed it, let's say, from a guy named Nikolai. That song had existed out there, but he takes that melody and turns it into this spectacular cantata, which lasts about 20-25 minutes, with 7 movements. We're only going to look at 3 of them, don't worry. And so on we go, right? So that's the story behind it. Did I forget anything? I don't think so. So let's begin. And now let me just play the beginning of it. And we don't start, as it turns out, with the melody. On page 137, now you can look at your sheets here. Cantata140 by Johann Sebastian Bach. We get that melody. Let me just play the melody for you once through. I'm sorry, get my rhythm right. Let me do that again. And then that repeats. Sorry, this thing is a little smaller than normal, so I'm getting confused. And that was just a repeat of that first melody. Now we're at letter B. So that was, in terms of form, and you'll see that a lot of hymns do that, you get something like this. A-A-B. That's A. Right? That's A again. It's easier to do it this way. That's B. Right? So far so good? That's the melody. That's the melody that Bach borrowed. Again, it goes like this. Let's take a look at take a look at page 138, 139, and you can see the translation. Wake the voice of the watchman. Calls us on high from the tower. You see where it is on the right side? The words are here, and the English is next to it. So wake the voice of the watchman, calls us from high on the tower. Okay, that's close enough. Wake you city of Jerusalem, midnight is this very hour. Okay, close enough. They call to us with bright voices. Where are you, wise virgins? Take cheer, the bridegroom comes. Arise, take up your lamps. Alleluia. Alleluia. Prepare yourselves for the wedding. You must go forth to meet him. Okay, obviously we're missing something, right? So what is this about the bridegroom coming? And what does that have to do with the night's watchman? Does anyone know the story from Matthew in the New Testament? Okay, it's a strange, arguably, a strange metaphor for the coming of Jesus. Jesus himself tells it. Is that right? I believe. And it says, and he says, when the time comes, when the bridegroom comes to the city, the maidens need to be ready. In other words, it's a strange metaphor for when the moment of death comes, or when the moment of fulfillment comes, which is kind of the same thing for the Middle Ages, right? When it's time to meet God, so to speak, which is like symbolically a wedding, right? Our soul is wedded to a spiritual dimension. The Arabs play with this, the same symbolism, by the way. In Arabic literature, there's a lot of romantic literature that has this idea of the romance of men and women being kind of a metaphor for union with God. So the Christians picked up that same symbolism, as that when preparing for a wedding, preparing for the coming of the bridegroom is like preparing for your own reunion with God. Curious thing. But anyway, the idea being is if you have your lamps lit at all times, and the night watchman looks out into the night and said, oh, there he is in the middle of the night, he's coming, and you don't have your lamps lit in the darkness, right? Then you're not ready for the reunion with God. You're not ready for the bridegroom, so to speak. We are all the maidens, really, so to speak. Does that make sense? So in other words, what does it mean to have your lamps lit? It means to be leading a good life. It means to be spiritually aware. It means to be, all the things that we think of as the good, religiously aware idea. So far, so good? Okay, so Nikolai picks this up in his hymn tune. Bach is going to play with it. Now, let's go to finally the beginning of the cantata. The first movement starts with the orchestra, not the voices. And here's a question for you. What does the orchestra do? And I'm going to use I think because I have to run back and forth too far to the machine, I'll just use my little machine here to go through. So you won't see it up here. I guess you'll just see me, which is boring, but no. So let's begin with, I'm going to just play a very short snippet, and I want you to tell me, what is Baroque about the way Bach sets up the music at the very beginning? The very beginning. You see it on page 138 at the very top.
Same notes but different instruments.
Exactly.
Passing the notes.
Exactly. It's exactly the same thing, right? Right out of the Baroque playbook, right? So it starts out with the violins, yum, da dum, dum, and then the oboes go yum, da dum. Exactly the same thing, right? The only thing that gives that interest, the fact that it's repeated, any interest, is that it's a different instrument, right? And it's one note. I mean, it's really nothing more than one note. So you've got this already starts out with this Baroque dualism that we've heard before. And then we hear it again, but something changes. Another dualism, as we go on. Two more measures. Now, what you first heard was where it says violins, yum, da-dum, that's called one measure. Then the oboes, yum, da-dum, da-dum, dum. Then we hit the violins again, yum, da-dum, da-dum, dum. And then the oboes go yum, da-dum, da-dum, dum. The same dualism, but not exactly the same dualism, right? Oboes, violins, oboes, that's the same. What's different?
Very high, going up higher.
The oboes take it up a notch, right? So it's a repetition of the same dualism with a complication. Okay? And that adds a little bit of energy. So what we're doing is it's almost like we're starting with that old style. Remember we said the old style of Baroque, the early style, was a stark contrast. We feel that in the first measure. We feel it in the second measure, but we're adding a little complication. And now when we go to the fourth and fifth measures, it's almost like we're starting to move into something more like the late style. The late style was more like constant motion, right? Listen to what happens now. What happened there? What was the same and what was different as 1 and 2 and 3 and 4? When you look at measures 5 and 6. What was same is easy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, just say it for the sake of redundancy.
It's repeating.
Yeah,
It's just different.
different heights, you could say, right? Or pitches, yeah. Right, so the violins and the oboes imitate each other again, right? So you get that dualism again. And now it's higher again, although that was similar to the second and third measures, right, where the oboes were higher than the violins. And what else is different? What makes it more complicated still than the third and fourth measures?
Change in notes.
Yeah, yeah, da 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 da. Suddenly the notes are moving much faster, right? Yeah, pa 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 pa. And then okay, what happened there? Okay, let me just remind you. First two measures, oboes, the violins played something. Oboes played exactly the same thing. Third and fourth measures, violins played something. Oboes played almost the same thing, but on a higher beat level. Fifth and sixth measures, violins played da 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 da, more excited, more quicker notes. The oboes imitated a little higher, but there's more action, right? And now you get the violins, same thing again, oboes, violins, and repeat. And then the violins go I could tell you exactly how far it goes, but it hardly ever stops, right? We're in the late style now, aren't we? That constant motion. What are the oboes doing in that meantime? Are they going to wait and repeat now? Let's listen. See if you can figure out what has happened to that dualism of the violins, and then the oboes, and then the violins, and then the oboes, and then the violins, and then the oboes. And I'll ring the bell when we get to that point. Takes them a while to get their music out. Repeat. Violins. Oboes higher. More action. Violins. Oboes. Now what happens? What are the oboes doing? Yeah?
Stretching the notes.
Yeah. While the violins are going, all of a sudden you've got what's called polyphony. Two different notes going, two different voices going at the same time. In the space of 8 measures, Bach has gone from a very simple repetition to a more complex repetition, to a more complex repetition, to polyphony. And that building excitement, of course, if we draw it out as I just did to 5 minutes, it feels like a drag. But if you hear it within the context of what it is about 6 seconds, you can sense this excitement. Now, why would he do that? Why would he start with something really staid and then go to something more and more and more complicated when we know what the first word's going to be?
Wake up.
Wake up! Right? It makes perfect sense. You can almost hear people going, this excitement that's coming up. And then let's see what happens when the words do come in. Can you hear the melody? Who's singing the melody? This is an advanced question. Who's singing the melody? Does anyone know? Just take a shot. You remember there are 4 voices in a choir, right? Do you remember what those are? Real quickly?
Soprano.
Soprano.
Alto.
Tenor and bass.
Tenor and bass. Sometimes these are sung by boys. In Bach's day, actually, they were usually sung by boys. And the tenors and basses were sung by men. Sometimes they're sung by women. You can see that on the top one is the is the soprano line. So the sopranos are singing these long notes. What are the other voices doing? All three of these guys. Altos, tenors, and basses. Can you hear that? Should I go back for it a little bit? All the other voices are singing around, like this one voice is going, and all the others are, wake up, wake up. It's like all these other little voices are running around going, what the heck's going on here, right? I was going to say what the hell, but that's actually probably not right for this piece. Right? So, and so you get this also a typical, by the way, a typical Baroque thing is happening here, that where the melody is happening in these really long notes, and all the other voices are kind of dancing around it. So you get, remember when we talked about the laws of motion that Galileo and Newton came up with, and this fascination, almost obsession, in the Baroque era with movement and motion. You've got all this movement around with these three voices, you know, wake up, wake up, wake up, and through all that, there's this one piece of solid focus that holds it all together, and that's called the cantus firmus. And the cantus firmus, you hear that again and again in Baroque, late Baroque style, is when we have all these voices, and this is called polyphony. It means many voices going on at the same time. And remember that one of the problems for the Baroque era was to try to find some sense of order, some sense of focus, some sense of constancy in the motion of the world, in the uncertainty of the world, in the world of ideas, in the world of the relationship between the sexes, in the world of music. And so this cantus firmus literally means firm or solid song, or sound, or voice. Cantus is the Latin for song or singing. And so this becomes like or you could call it the foundation. In all of this movement, we're seeking for some sort of hold, right? And that makes sense it makes perfect sense for the symbolism of this piece. We are in darkness. We don't know what our fate is after our death. We don't know what it means to be human beings who are fallible, sometimes worse than fallible, sometimes downright evil. And what does that mean for our ultimate place in the world, in the universe? And the answer, according to this piece, and according to Christianity, is in Christmas, in the coming of Jesus. So all that kind of hangs together in the style of the Baroque, the symbolism of the night watchman in the darkness who sees that there will be light soon. Don't worry, the light is coming. Wake up. And then, of course, the polyphony and the cantus firmus together. Does it make sense? Now let's just, having said all that, let's go a little bit farther, and I'll point out, as we go through this, see if I can do that. On the left side of your guide, now looking at page 139, I'll try to just walk us through this this study guide, or this learning, or what they call listening guide. I think, let's see if I can just do those 25 seconds. This is called an orchestral ritornello. It's a piece of music in the orchestra that comes up again and again. You'll hear it later on. Oboe long notes, and the violin's quick notes underneath. Polyphony. Now the first soprano, cantus firmus. All the the other voices start coming in. Ritornello again. Calls us on the high from the tower. Rising scales in the lower voices depict the high up on the ramparts. The white watchman is up high on the towers. Ritornello. Wake up. Wake up. Of the Orchestra Ritornello. We're at the 2-minute mark almost. It's called a ritornello because it repeats. You've heard that before. Now this is the end of the first A section. Now the A section is going to repeat with new words. There it is. Later on you can listen to this without my voice in the middle of it. Right? Notice the orchestra just fell away, and then the basses come in, doom, 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 going right up the ladder, as if all the voices are by themselves, and this sort of sense of anticipation because it sounds thin, and all of a sudden it comes back again with it. Take cheer is what they were singing in the background. The bridegroom comes. That was the end of the A section the second time. Key change, by the way, but you don't have to really hear that. Now this time the other voices came in first. Well, as if they're getting excited and they're actually coming in ahead of the main voice, ahead of the melody. Happens again here. Get up, get up, get up, right? There's the main melody. Now the Alleluia, we lose the melody completely. Now it's just a lot of polyphony. Everything becomes polyphony all of a sudden. Until the melody comes in way late. There it is. As if the excitement of the crowd, of the many people, of us, is starting to get ahead of the main melody. It's almost as if the weight has shifted from this to this, right? And so this motion is taking over because we are all waking up, I suppose. That's the first movement, that's by far the longest movement. We can cut it now for a moment,